Hello again, this is video number 5 of the review of microeconomic topics. And this video, the 5th video, will talk about trade, international trade, why and how it occurs, and what are the effects on consumers and producers domestically. So the first thing we want to do is identify a market in some commodity. This market will look like this. So we have a market, and this market has its own equilibrium P star and Q star. And this is an autarky. Autarky means only that it's an independent country that's not engaging in trade. So this country that's not trading right now has an equilibrium price and quantity for this commodity. Question we ask is, well, in the terms of trade, if there were to be trade, particularly if there were to be imports to come into the country, those products need to be more attractive than the products we already have, as in the price needs to be lower. So if we're going to have imports into the country, we have to have a world price that's lower than this price. But before we do that, let's just remind ourselves of the producer and consumer surplus under autarky. So we have these regions here that, as we know, correspond to producer and consumer surplus. This is consumer surplus here. And this is producer surplus. The surpluses being the difference between the willingness to pay, identified by the demand curve, and the amount that the consumers actually pay. And for the producers, it's the willingness to supply a quantity at a particular price and the price that the producers receive. So in the case of trade, we have then, well, if there's going to be trade, a world price that must be less than P star. If the world price is greater than P star, there's no reason for our consumers to want to buy that more expensive product. So let's put in a line here that's a little bit arbitrary. I'm just drawing one. And this is going to be P sub W. That's the world price. World price being less than P star, which is the equilibrium price in autarky without trade. So now we have this world prices down here, and the question we ask is, well, what will the consumers in this country do? Well, we can see from the supply curve that producers were willing and able to supply this quantity of this product, which I'm going to call Q domestic. They're willing to supply Q domestic from 0 to there, this quantity, because the supply curve was underneath this prevailing world price. So this world price is still equal to or greater than the price that the firm required to produce this quantity. So the domestic manufacturers are fine with that. Consumers, on the other hand, we look at the demand curve and see the demand curve is above this world price all the way out to this intersection at this point. At that point, well, the marginal benefit is exactly equal to the marginal cost of this product on the world market. The consumer will be satisfied. So consumers are going to demand consumers are going to demand this entire quantity. This entire quantity is where the world price intersects their demand curve. But because we know that the domestic suppliers can produce and supply that much at that price, this quantity comes from domestic manufacturers. And this quantity then corresponds to imports. And there we have it. So now we have a situation where we've opened up our markets, we're permitting these products to be imported by our consumers, and consumers then switch into this for this quantity. What happens to the surpluses? Well, the domestic manufacturers only make this much. They receive that much. So this surplus that used to be out here now is reduced for the producers to that. That becomes producer surplus. Consumers, on the other hand, receive the difference between their demand curve, what they're willing to pay and what they do pay, and this entire area now is consumer surplus. And the net gain to society, to this domestic society, which is really part of what the consumers realize, is this wedge here, which is new surplus that did not exist previously, and this part of the surplus that once was producer surplus is transferred to the consumers. In summation, who gains, who loses? In this situation, when the world price is beneath the equilibrium price of our own manufacturing autarky, well, there's additional imports, and consumers get the benefit of the lower cost item, the good that is imported. Total surplus increases, and the domestic producers can't compete as well, and they lose some of their producer surplus to the consumers and sell a lower quantity at the lower prevailing world price. So competitive foreign products at low prices, typically not favored by producers, by domestic manufacturers, but consumers enjoy them. If we were to have a tariff, what would happen with a tariff? A tariff would make this world price seem higher to the consumer, which essentially says it's going to shift upwards. So to raise some of this, what we would see, or maybe just draw it on top, the world price now would shift upwards by the amount of a tariff, and that'd be the PW with a tariff. And we can see that this entire region here, goes away. Question is, who gets it? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Consumer surplus shrinks, and it's only this area now. So consumers lose. The local producers, well, my goodness, as the price, the effective price that the consumer sees goes up, the local manufacturer can compete better. So tariffs are favored by local manufacturers. They can compete better, so they can now produce this quantity. This becomes acute domestic with a tariff. They expand the output, they recapture this amount of producer surplus, and they gain some here. Sorry, this amount here, pardon me. And what happens here, is that suddenly we have two things. First is that in this quantity, this is the quantity now that we get from the world, well, we're making less than we used to make, or rather we're buying and importing less than we used to import. So this wedge here, that was part of consumer surplus with imports, goes away. That becomes a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. This amount here was part of consumer surplus. It doesn't happen any longer. So this one becomes a deadweight loss also. And this block in here, hey, that's part of the tariff that's collected by the government. So it's additional revenues for the government. So government gains, they have the money they collect on the tariffs, on the taxes, on this amount of goods that becomes the import. The imports shrink from here to here. You get a tax on that. Consumers lose some of their surplus, and producers gain some surplus, and the society loses these two triangular wedges, which were the part of the surplus before, now become deadweight loss. So it's still better for the consumer than the consumer was in this initial autarky stage, but it's not as good as for the consumer as when we had completely open markets, free to import without any tariffs. The last thing we want to look at is the situation of what would happen, I have to redraw this, if we were to have a world price that was above the domestic price. So go back here and fix this a little bit. Redraw these curves. Supply, demand. We had our original equilibrium. And now we put the world price above the domestic equilibrium. P sub W is up there. Well, would our consumers want to import? No. It's higher than P star. They don't want to import, but the rest of the world, wow, my goodness, we were able to manufacture at this price. Suddenly our products are very competitive, and we can find that our products can compete on the world market. So in this situation, our manufacturers are able to export their product. They can export their product up to the point where their supply curve says that this is the amount of money that they require to produce that quantity. So the total domestic manufacturing increases, Q domestic, but at this world price, because our domestic manufacturers can receive P sub W, that becomes the prevailing price in our market also. So our consumers Our consumers suffer. This is consumer, this is the consumers, domestic. And this quantity in this situation becomes exports. So, what was consumer surplus now shrinks to this little piece. Producer surplus, which was here, expands all the way up to this level. It becomes producer surplus. And this is a net gain to our society. However, in summation, what happens is consumers are battered because now they have to compete with the world for this good and the price goes up in the domestic market. But producers find this very attractive because suddenly they're able to produce and sell more than they were selling before. The AP typically, if it has anything at all, probably will focus much more on the situation of imports. Who gains, who loses, what's happening when we're importing. This is just to make sure that if there were to be a question about exports, there's some basic understanding. But I urge much more to focus on the other explanations that preceded this, which were about the situation where the world price is lower than equilibrium price in our own country. And that's the end of the 5th segment on trade.